Hi friends, continuing to the chapter The Interpretant of Maladies. Daddy, the monkey hurting Bobby, Tina said. Mr. Das wiped his palm on the front of his shorts. In his nervousness, he accidentally pressed the shutter on his camera. The whirring noise of the advancing film excited the monkeys, and the one with the stick began to beat Bobby more intently. What are we supposed to do? What if they start attacking? Mr. Capasi, Mrs. Das shrinkered, noticing him standing to one side. Do something, for the God's sake, do something. Mr. Capasi took his branch and shooted them away, hissing at the one that remained, stooping his feet to scare them. The animals retreated slowly with a measuring gait, obedient but unintimidated. Mr. Capasi gathered a Bobby in his arms and brought him back to where his parents and siblings were standing. As he carried him, he was tempted to whisper a secret into the boy's ear. But Bobby was stunned and shivering with the fright, his legs bleeding slightly where the stick had broken the skin. When Mr. Capasi delivered him to his parent, Mr. Dash brushed some dirt off the boy's t-shirt and put the visors on him the right away. Mrs. Das reached into her straw bag to find a band-aid which she taped over the cut on his knee. Ronnie offered him his brother a fresh piece of gum. He is fine, just a little scared, right, Bobby? Mr. Das said, patting the top of his head. God, let us go out of here, Mrs. Das said. She folded her arms across the strawberry on her chest. This place gives me the creep. Yeah, back to the hotel, definitely, Mr. Das agreed. Poor Bobby, Mrs. Das said. Oh, come on, come here a second. Let mommy fix your hair. Again, she reached into her straw bag, this time for her hairbrush, and began to run it around the edge of an translucent visor. When she wiped out with the hairbrush the sip of a paper with Capasi's address on it fluently away in his wind. No one but Capasi noticed. He watched as it rose, carried higher and higher by the breeze, into the trees where the monkey now sat. Solemnly observing the scene below, Mr. Capasi observed it too, knowing that this was the picture of Das family he would preserve forever in his mind. A real Dravan. Buri Ma, sweeper of an stairwell, had not slept in last 2 nights. So the morning before the third night she shook the mites out of her bedding. She shook the quills once underneath the letter boxes where she lived, then once again at the mouth of the alley, causing the crows who were feeding on the vegetable peels to shatter in several directions. As she started up the flight to the roof, Brumima kept one hand placed over the knee that swelled at the start of every rainy season. That meant that her bucket, quills, and the bundle of reeds which served as her broom all had to be braced under one arm. Lately, Brumima had been thinking that the stairs were getting steeper. Climbing them felt more like climbing a ladder than a staircase. She was 64 years old, with a hair in a knot no longer than a valment, and she hooked almost as a narrow from the front as she did from the side. In fact, the only thing that appeared three-dimensional about Burima was her voice, brittle with the sorrows, a start at a curts, and shrill enough to grate meat for a coconut. It was with his voice that she enumerated twice a day as she swept the stairwells the details of her flight and losses suffered since her deportation to Calcutta from Paritoyan. At the time she maintained, the turmoil had separated her from husband, 4 daughters, a 2-story brick house, a rosewood alamari, and a number of cough boxes whose skeleton keys she still wore, along with her life savings tied to free end of her salary. Aside from her hardships, the other thing Burima liked to chronicle was easier times. And so, by the time she reached the second floor landing, she had already drawn to the whole building attention the menu of her third daughter wedding night. We married her to a school principal. The rice was cooked in rose water. The mayor was invited. Everybody washed their fingers in bevertral bowls. Here she paused, even out her berth, and readjusted the supplies under her arm. She took the opportunity also to chase a cockroach out of her banister poles, then continued. Mustard prawns were steamed in banana leaves. Not a delicacy was spared. Not that this was an extravagant for us. At our house, we ate goat twice a week. We had a pond on our property full of fish. By now, Burima could see some light from the roof spilling into an stairwell. And although it was only 8 o'clock, the sun was already strong enough to warm the last of a cement step under her feet. It was a very old building, the kind with the bathwater that still had to be stored in drums. Windows with the outglasses and privacy scaffolds made of bricks. A man came to pick out the dates and govas. Another clipped the hibiscus. Yes, there I tasted life. Here I eat my dinner from a rice pot. At this point, in the rectangular Burima, ears started to burn. A pain chipped through her swollen knees. Have I mentioned that I crossed the border with just 2 bracelets on my wrist? Yet there was a day when my feet touched nothing but the marble. Believe me, don't believe me, such comforts you don't even dream them. Whether there was any truth to Burima's likeness, no one could be sure. For something every day, the perimeters of her former estate seems to be double, as did the connects of her alamari and the coffee boxes. No one doubted she was a refuge. The accent in her Bengali made her that clear. Still, the residents of this particular flat building could not reconcile Burima's claim to prior wealth alongside the more likely account of how she had crossed the East Bengal border with 1,000 of the others on the back of a truck because sack of a heap. And yet there were days where Burima, instead that she had come to Calcutta on a bullock cart. Which was it, by truck or by the cart? The children sometimes asked her on their way to play cops and robbery in the alley, to which Burima would reply, shaking the free end of her sari so that the skeleton key rattled. They demand specific. Why cramp lime from a betel leaf? Believe me, don't believe me. My life is composed of such griefs you cannot even dream them. So she gulped facts. She contradicted herself. She embellished almost everything, but her rants were so persuasive, her fretting so vivid, that it was not easy to dismiss her. What kind of landowner ended up sweeping the stairs? That's what my dalal of the third floor always wondered as he passes Burima on his way to office and from the office, where he files the receipt for the wholesale distributors of rubber, tubes, pipes, and wall fittings in the plumbing district of College Streets. Bekhari. She probably construct tales as a way of mountaining the loss of her family, was the collective surmise of most of the wives. And Burima mouth is full of ashes, but she is a victim of changing times, was a refrain of old Mr. Chatterjee. He had neither strayed from his balcony nor opened a newspaper since independence. But in spite of this fact, or maybe because of it, his opinion was always highly esteemed. The theory eventually circulated that Burima had once worked as hired help for a prosperous Jamindar back east and was therefore capable of extrapolating her past at such elaborate length and heights. Her throaty impostures hurt no one. All agreed that she was superb entertainer. In exchange for her loading below the letter boxes, Burima kept their covered stairwells spotlessly clean. Most of all, the residents liked that Burima who slept each night behind the collectible gate, stood guard between them and the outside world. No one in this particular flat building owned much worth stealing. The second floor window, Mrs. Misra, was the only one with a telephone. Still, the residents were thankful that Burima patrolled activities in the alley, screened the itinerant peddlers who came to sell the combs and the shawl from the door to door, was able to summon a rickshaw at a moment calling, and could, with a few slaps of her bathroom, rout an suspicious character who strafed into the area in order to spit, urinate, or cause some other problem. In short, over the years, Burima's services came to resemble those of a real Darwin. Though under the normal circumstances, this was no job for a woman. She honored the responsibility and maintained a vigil no less punctilious than if she were the gatekeepers of a house on Lower Circular Road or Jodhpur Park or any other fancy neighborhood. On the rooftop, Burima hung her quills over the clothesline. The wire shrunk diagonally from one corner of the parapet to the other, stretched across her views of television antennas, billboards, and the distant arches of Howrah Bridge. Burima consulted the origin of all her four sides. Then she ran the tap at the base of an cistern. She washed her face, rinsed her feet, and rubbed the two fingers over her teeth. After this, she started to beat the quills on each side with her broom. Every now and then she stopped and quantiled at the cement, hoping to identify the culprit of her sleepless night. She was so absorbed in this process that it was some moment before she noticed Mr. Dalal of the third floor, who have come to set a tray of salted lemon peels out to dry in the sun. Whatever is inside this gullet is keeping me awake at night, Burima said. Tell me, where do you see them? Mrs. Dalal had a soft spot for Burima. Occasionally, she gave the old woman some ginger paste, which is to flavor her stews. I don't see anything, Mrs. Dalal said. After a while, she had Dinophosis eyelids and very slender toes with the rings on them. Then they must have wings, Borima concluded. She put down her broom and observed one cloud passing behind the other. They fly away before I can squish them. But there, see my back, I must be purple from their bites. Mr. Dalal lifted the drap of Borima's sari, a cheap white view with a border the color of a dirty pond. She examined the skin above and below her blouse, cut in a style no longer solid in the soap. Then she said, Borima, you are imagining things. I tell you, these mites are eating me alive. I could be a case of prisky heat, Mrs. Dalal suggested. At the Borima shook the free end of her sari and made her skeleton keys rattle, she said, I know pricky heat. This is not a pricky heat. I haven't slept in 3, perhaps 4 days. Who can count? I used to keep a clean bed. Our linens were Muslims. Believe me, don't believe me. Your mosquitoes' nets were so soft, so silk. Such comforts you cannot ever dream them. I cannot dream them, Mrs. Dalal echoed. She lowered her diaphysis eyelid and sighed. I cannot dream them, Borima. I live in 2 broken rooms, married to a man who sells toilet parts. Mrs. Dalal turned away and looked at one of the quills. She ran a finger over the part of their stitchings. Then she asked, Borima, how long have you stepped on this bedding? Borima put a finger to her lips before replying that she could not remember. Then why no mention of it until today? Do you think it is beyond us to provide you with clean quilts? An oilcloth for the matters. She looks insulted. There is no need, Borima said. They are clean now. I bet them with my broom. I am hearing no arguments, Mr. Dalal said. You need a new bed, quilts, a pillow, a blanket when winter comes. As she spoke, Mrs. Dalal kept track of the necessary items by touching her thumb to the pads of her finger. On festival days, the poor came to her house to be fed. Borima said she was filling her bucket from the coal heap on the other side of the roof. I will have a word with Mr. Dalal when he returns from the office, Mrs. Dalal called back as she headed down the stairs. Come in the afternoon. I will give you some pickle and powder for your back. It is not pricky heat, Borima said. It was true that pricky heat was common during the rainy season. But Borima preferred to think that what irritates her bed, what stole her sleep, what burnt like pepper across her thinning scalp and skin, was of less mundane origin. She was ruminating on these things and she swept the stairwell. She always worked from top to bottom. When it started to rain, it came slapping across the roof like a boy in slippers too big for him and washed Mrs. Dalal lemon peels into the gutter. Before pedestrians could open their umbrellas, it rushed down the collars, pockets, and the shoes. In that particular flat building and all the neighbors' building, creaky shutters were closed and tied with an petticoat strings to the window bars. At the time, Borima was working all the way down on her second floor landing. She looked up the ladder-like stairs, and as the sound of falling water tightening around her, she knew her quills were turning into a grut. But then she recalled her conversation with Mrs. Dalal, and so she continued at the same page. To sweep the dust, cigarette and and loungy wrappers from the rest of the step, until she reached the litter box at the bottom. To keep out the wind, she rumbled through her basket for some newspaper and crammed them into the diamond-shaped opening of the collapsible gate. Then on her buttock of a coal, she set her lunch to boil and monitored the flame with an planted palm leaf. That afternoon, as was her habit, Borima reknotted her hair, untied the loose end of her sari, and counted out her life saving. She had just woken for a nap of 20 minutes, which she had taken a temporary bedmate for newspapers. The rain had stopped, and now the sour smell that rises from the wet mango leaves were hanging low over the alley. On certain afternoons, Borima visited her fellow residents. She enjoyed drifting in and out of various households. The residents, for their part, assured Borima that she was always welcome. They never drew that the latch bus across their doors except at night. They went about their business, scolding children or adding up expenses or picking stone out of evening rice. From time to time, she was handed a glass of a tea. The crackers tin was passed in her direction, and she kept children shoot chips across the carom board. Knowing not to sit on the furniture, she crouched instead in a doorway and the hallways. Unobserved gestures and the manners in the same way a person tends to watch the traffic in a foreign city. On this particular afternoon, Borima decided to accept Mrs. Dalal's invitation. Her back still itched, even after napping on the newspaper, and she was beginning to want something pricky heat powder after all. She picked up her broom. She never felt quite herself without it, and was about to climb upstairs when a rickshaw pulled up to collapsible gate. It was Mr. Dalal. The years he had spent filling receipts had left him with a purple crescent under his eyes. But today his gaze was bright. The tip of his tongue played between his teeth. In that clamp of his thighs, he held two small symmetric basins. Borima, I have a job for you. Help me carry these basins upstairs. He pressed a folded handkerchief to her forehead and throat and gave the rickshaw driver a coin. Then he and Borima carried the basins all the way up to the third floor. It wasn't until they were inside the flat that he finally announced to Mrs. Dalal, to Borima, and to a few other residents who have followed them out of curiosity, the following things: that his hearts-filled receipts for an distributors of rubber tubes, pipes and the wall fittings had ended, that the distributor himself, who craved fresh air and whose profits have doubled, was opening a second branch in Burdwan, and that following an assignment of his sedulous performance over the years, the distributors was promoting Mr. Dalal to manage the College Street branch. In his excitement on his way home through the plumbing district, Mr. Dalal had bought 2 basins. What are we supposed to do with the 2 basins in a 2-room flat? Mrs. Dalal demanded. She had already been sunking over her lemon peels. Whoever heard of it? I still cook on the kerosene. You refuse to apply for a phone, and I haven't yet to see the fridge you promised when we married. You expect 2 basins to make up for all that. The argument that followed was loud enough to be heard all the way down to the letter box. It was loud enough and long enough to raise about a second spell of a rain that falls after the dark. It was loud enough even to distract Borima as she swept the stairwells from top to bottom for the second time that day. And for this reason, she spoke neither of her hardships nor of an easier time. She spent the night on a bed of newspaper. The argument between Mr. and Mrs. Dalal was still more or less in effect early the next morning, when a barefoot team of workmen came to install the basins after a nice night of tossing and pacing. Mr. Dalal had decided to install one basin in the sitting room on their flat and the other one on the stairwell of a building on the first floor landing. This way everyone can use it, he explained from door to door. The residents were delighted. For years they have all brushed their teeth with toad water poured from mugs. Mr. Dalal meanwhile was thinking, a sink on a stairwell is sure to impress visitors. Now that he was a company manager who could say who might visit the building. The workmen toiled for several hours. They ran up and downstairs and ate their lunches, quanting against the Banksister's pole. They hammered, shouted, spat, and cursed. They wiped their sweat with the end of their turbans. In general, they made it impossible for Borima to sweep the stairwell that day. To occupy the time, Borima retired to the rooftop. She shuffled along the parapets, but her hips were sore from sleeping on newspaper. After consulting the origin of on all the four sides, she tore what was left of her quilts into several strips and resolved to polish the banister poles at a later time. But early evening, the residents gathered to admire the day's labor. Even Borima was urged to rinse her hands under the clear running water. She sniffed. Our bath water was decent with the petals and atters. Believe me, don't believe me, it was a luxury you cannot dream. Mr. Dalal proceeded to demonstrate the basin's various features. He turned each facet completely on and completely off. Then he turned on both fetters at the same time to illustrate the difference in the water pressure. Lifting a small lever between the factors allowed water to collect in the basin if desired. The last word is elegance, Mr. Dalal concluded. A sure sign of changing the times, Mr. Chatterjee's reputedly admitted from his balcony. Among the wives, however, resentment quickly brewed. Standing in the line to brush their teeth in the morning, each get frustrated with having their teeth in the mornings. Each grew frustrated with having to wait for her turn, for having to wipe their fetuses after every use, and for not being to leave her own soap and toothbrush tube on the basin's narrow periphery. The Dalal had his own snick. Why do the rest them to have to share? Is it beyond us to buy a sink of our own? One of them finally burst out one morning. Or the Dalal is the only one who can improve the condition of this building? Asked another. Rumors began spreading that following their arguments, Mr. Dalal had consoled his wife by buying her 2 kilos of mustard oil, a cashmere shawl, a dozen cake of sandalwood soap. That Mr. Dalal had filled an application for a telephone line. That Mrs. Dalal did nothing but washed her hand in her basin all the days. As if they weren't enough, the next morning a taxi bound for Howrah station crammed its wheel into the alley. The Dalals were going to Simla for 10 days. Borima, I have forgotten. We will bring you back a sheep's hair blanket made in the mountains. Mrs. Dalal said that through the open window of the taxi. She was holding a leather purse in her lap, which matched the trochee border of her sari. "We will bring two," cried Mr. Dalal, who was sitting behind his wife, checking his pocket to make sure his wallet was in his place. Of all the people who lived in their particular flat building, Borima was the only one who stood by the collapsile gate and wished them a safe journey. As soon as the Dalals were gone, the other wives began planning renovation of their own. One decided to barter a stack of her wedding bracelet and commission a white washer to freshen the walls of the stairwell. Another pawned her sewing machine and summoned an estimators. A third went to the silversmith and sold back a set of pudding bowls. She intended to have the shutters painted yellow. Workers began to occupy this particular flat building night and day. To avoid the traffic, Borima took to sleeping on the rooftop. So many people passed in and out of the gate. So many others clogged that the alley all the times that there was no point in keeping track of them. After a few days, Borima moved her baskets and her cooking buckets to the rooftop as well. There was no need to use the basin downwards, for she could just as easily wash as she always had from the citron tap. She still planned to polish the banister poles with the stripes she had torn from her quilts. She continued to sleep on her newspaper. More rain came. Below the dripping awning, a newspaper pressed over her head. Borima squatted and watched the monsoon ants as they marched along the clothes line, carrying eggs in their mouths. Damper winds soothed her back. Her newspaper were running low. Her morning were long, her afternoon longer. She could not remember her last glass of tea. Thinking neither of her hardship nor of her earlier times, she wondered when the Dalals would return with the new bedding. She grew restless on the roof, and so far, for some exercises, Borima started circling the neighborhood in the afternoons. Reed broom in hand, sari smudged with a newsprint ink, she wandered through markets and began spending her life saving on small treats. Today, a packet full of puffed rice, tomorrow some cashew nuts, the day after that a cup of a sugarcane juice. One day, she walked even farther to the producer market in Bow Bazaar. It was there, while she was standing in a shopping arcade serving a jackfruit and persimmons, that she felt that something tugging on the free end of her sari. When she looked, the rest of her life saving and her skeleton keys were gone. The residents were waiting for Borima when she returned that afternoon at the gate. Baleful cries rang up and down the stairwells, all echoing the sad news. The basin on the stairwells have been stolen. There was a big hole in the recently whitewashed wall, and a tangle of rubber tubes and pipes was sticking out of it. Chunk of plaster littered the landing. Borima gripped her red broom and said nothing. In the heat, the resident partially carried Borima up the stairs to the roof, while they planted her on one side of the cloth line and started screaming at her from the other. "This is all her doing," one of them hollered, pointed at Borima. she informed the robbers. Where was she when she was supposed to guard the gate? For the days she has been wandering the street, speaking to the strangers, another reported. We shared our coal, gave her a place to sleep. How could she betray us this way? A third wanted to know. Though none of them spoke directly to Borima, she replied, believe me, I did not inform the robbers. For years we have put up with your lies. They retorted, you accept us now to believe you. Their resentmentation persisted. How would they explain it to the Dallas? Eventually, they sought the advice of Mr. Chatterjee. They found him sitting on his balcony watching a traffic jam. One of the second floor residents said Borima had endangered the security of this building. We have values. The window with Mrs. Mishra lives alone with her phone. What should we do? Mr. Chatterjee considered their arguments. As he thought things over, he adjusted the shawl that was wrapped around his shoulders and gazed at the bamboo scaffoldings that now surrounded his balcony. The shutters behind him, colorless for as long as he could remember. He been painted yellow. Finally he said, Borima mouth is full of ashes, but that is now nothing new. What is new is the face of this building. What a building like this needs is a real Darwin. So the residents tossed her bucket and rags, her baskets and the red broom down the stairwells, past the red boxes, through the gate and into the alley. Then they tossed out Borima. All were eager to begin their search for a real Doran. From the pile of belonging, Borima kept only her blue. Believe me, she said once more as her figure began to recede. She took the free end of her sari, but nothing rattled. It was a wife's worst nightmare after 9 years of marriage. Lakshmi told Miranda her cousin's husband has fallen in love with another woman. He sat next to her on a plane on a flight from Delhi to Montreal, and instead of flying home to his wife and son, he got off with that woman at Heathrow. He called his wife and told her that he had a conversation that has changed his life and that he needed time to figure the things out. Lakshmi cousins had taken to her bed. Not that I blame her, Lakshmi said. She reached for the hot mix she munched throughout the day, which looked to Miranda like dusky orange cereal. Imagine an English girl half his age. Lakshmi was only a few years older than Miranda, but she was already married and kept a photo of herself and her husband seated on a white stone beach in front of a Taj Mahal. Tackled to the inside of her cubicle, which was next to Miranda's, Lakshmi has been on the phone for at least an hour trying to calm her cousin down. No one noticed. They work for a public radio station in the fund-raising department and were surrounded by the people who spent all the days on the phone saluting the pledges. I feel worst for the boy, Lakshmi added. He has been at home for days. My cousin said she can't even take him to school. It sounds awful, Miranda says. Normally, Lakshmi phoned conversations mainly to her husband about what to cook for dinner, distracted Miranda as he typed the letters, asking members of the radio station to increase their annual pledge in exchange for a toti bag or an umbrella. She could hear Lakshmi clearly, her sentence prepared every now and then with an Indian word through the laminated wall between their desks. But that afternoon, Miranda hadn't been listening. She hadn't been on the phone herself with Dave, deciding where to meet later that evening. Then again, a few days at home won't hurt him. Lakshmi ate some more hot mix, then put it away in a drawer. He is something of a genius. He has a Punjabi mother and a Bengali father. And because he learns French and English at the school, he already speaks 4 languages. I think he skipped 2 grades. Dev was Bengali too. At first, Miranda thought it was a religion, but then he pointed it out to her, a place in India called Bengal. In a map printed is an issue of The Economist. He had brought the magazine especially to her apartment, for she did not own an atlas or any other books with a map in them. He pointed to the city where he had been born and another city where his father had been born. One of the cities had a box around it, intended to attract the reader's eye. When Miranda asked what the box indicates, Dave rolled up the magazine and said, "Nothing you will ever need to worry about," and he taped her playfully on the head. Before leaving her apartment, he had tossed the magazine in the garbage along with the end of the 3 cigarettes he always smoked in the course of his visits. But after she watched his car disappear down the Commonwealth Avenue back to his house in the suburbs where he lived with his wife, Miranda retrieved it and brushed the ash off the cover and rolled it in the opposite direction to get into the lie flat. She got into bed, still rumbled from their love-making, and studied the border of Bengal. There was a bay below and the mountain above. The map was connected to an article about something called the Grameen Bank. She turned the pages, hoping for a photograph of a city where Dev was born. But all she found were the graph and the grids. Still she stared at him, thinking the whole while about the Dev, about how only 15 minutes ago he propped her feet on the top of his shoulders and pressed her knees on her chest and told her that he couldn't get enough for her. She had met him a week ago at Flynn's. She was there on her lunch break buying a discounted pantyhose in the basement. Afterward, she looked the escalator to main part of the store, to the cosmetic department, where soaps and creams were displayed like jewels and eyeshadows or powder simmered like the butterflies pinned behind the protective glasses. Though Miranda had never bought anything other than a lipstick, she liked walking through that cramped, confit maze which was familiar to her in a way the rest of the Boston still was not. She liked negotiating her way past the women planted at every turn, who sprayed the carts with the perfume and waved them in the air. Sometimes she would find a cardi day afterwards, folded in her coat pocket and the rich aroma still faintly preserved, would warm her as she waited on a cold morning for the tea. The day stopped to smell one of the more pleasing carts. Miranda noticed a man standing at one of the counters. He held a sip of a paper covered in an Paris feminine hand. A saleswoman took one of a look at the paper and began to open the drawers. She produced an oblong cake of a soap in a black case a hydring mask, a vial of a cell renewal drops, and 2 tubes of a face cream. The man was tanned, with the black hair that was visible on his knuckles. He wore a Fambellino pink shirt and a navy blue suit, a camel overcoat with a gleaming leather buttons. In order to pay, he has taken off his pigskin gloves. Crisp bills emerged from an burgundy wallet. He didn't wear a wedding ring. What can I get you, honey? The saleswoman asked Miranda. She looks over the top of her tortoise shell glasses and assailing Miranda's complexions. Miranda didn't know what she wanted. All she knew was that she didn't want the man to walk away. He seems to be lingering, waiting along with the saleswoman for her to say something. She started at some bottles, some short, other tall, arranged on an oval tray like a family posing for a photograph. A cream, Miranda said eventually. How old are you? 22. The saleswoman nodded. Opening a frosted bottle, this may seems a bit heavier than what you have used to. But I would start now. All your wrinkles are going to form by 25. After that, they just started showing. While the saleswoman dabbed the cream on Miranda's face, the man stood and watched. While Miranda was told the proper was to apply it. In the shift upward, strokes beginning at the base of her throat. He spun the lipstick carousel. He pressed a palm that displayed cellulite gel and massaged it into a back of his ungloved hand. He opened a jar, leaned over, and drew so close that a drop of a cream fletched his nose. Miranda smiled, but her mouth was absorbed by a large brush that the saleswoman was sweeping over her face. This is blusher number 2, the woman said. Give you some colors. Miranda nodded, glancing at her reflection in one of an angled mirror that lined the counter. She had silver eyes and silk as pale as paper, and the contrast with her hair as dark as a glossy as an Expro bean caused people to describe her as striking, if not pretty. She had a narrow, eye-changed head that rose to the prominent point. Her features, too, were narrow, with the nostrils so slim that they appear to have been pinched with a clothespin. Now her face glowed, rosy at the cheeks, smoky below the brown bone. Her lips glistered. The man was glancing in a mirror too, quickly wiping the cream from his nose. Miranda wondered where he was from. She thought he might be Spanish or Lisbon. When he opened another jar and said to one in particular, "This one smells like pineapple," she detects only the hint of an accent. "Anything else for you today?" the saleswoman asked, accepting Miranda's credit card. "No, thanks." The woman wrapped the cream in several layers of red tissues. "You will be very happy with this product." Miranda's hands was unsteady and he signed the receipt. The man didn't budge. "I threw in a sample of a new eye gel," the saleswoman added, handing Miranda a small shopping bag. She looked at Miranda's credit card before sliding it across the counter. "Bye-bye, Miranda." Miranda began walking. At first, she shut up, then noticing the door that led to the downtown crossing, she slowed down. "Part of your name in India," the man said, packing his step with her. She stopped, as did he, at a circular table filled with the sweaters flanked with pin cones and velvet bows. Miranda, Mira, I have an aunt named Mira. His name was Dave. He worked in an investment bank back that way, he said, tickling his head in the direction of a south station. He was the first man with a mustache Miranda decided she found handsome. They walked together towards the park station, past the kiosks that sold cheap belts and handbags. A furious January wind spoiled the part in her hair. As she finished for a token in her coat paper, her eyes fell to his shopping bag. As those as are for her. Who? Your Aunt Mira? They are for my wife. He uttered the word slowly, holding Miranda's gaze. She is going to India for a few weeks back. He rolled his eyes. She addicted to his snuff. Somehow, without a wife there, it didn't seem so wrong. At first, Miranda and Dave spent every night together. Almost. He explained that he couldn't spend the whole night at her place because his wife called every day at 6 in the morning from India, where it was 4 in the afternoon. And so he left her apartment at 2, 3, often as late as 4 in the morning, driving back to his house in the suburbs. During the day, he called her about hours in, it seems from the work, or from his cell phone. Once he learned Miranda's schedule, she was on the T coming back to her apartment just so he said that she could hear his voice as soon as she walked through the door. I am thinking about you, he had said on the tape. I can't wait to see you. He told her he liked spending the time in her apartment, with its kitchen counter no wider than a bread box, and sketchy floor that sloped, and a buzzer in the lobby that always made a slightly embarrassing sound when he pressed it. He said he admired her for moving to Boston, where she knew no one, instead of remaining in Michigan, where she has grown up and gone to the college. When Miranda told him it was nothing to admire it, that she had moved to Boston purely for that reason. He shook his head. I know what it's like to be lonely, he said, suddenly serious, and that moment Miranda felt that he understood her, understood how she felt some nights on the T after seeing a movie on her own, or going to a bookstore to read magazine, or having a drink with Lakshmi, who always had to meet her husband at Alfile station in an hour or two. In less serious moments, Dave said he liked that her legs were longer than her torso. Sometimes he had observed the first time she walked across a room naked. You are the first, he told her, admiring her from the bed. The first woman I have known with the legs this long. Dave was the first to tell her that, unlike the boys she dated in the college, who are simply taller, heavier version of the ones she dated in the high school, Dave was the first always to pay for things and holds the door open and reach across a table in a restaurant to kiss her hand. He was the first to bring her a bouquet of a flower so immense she had to split it up into all 6 of her drinking glasses, and the first to whisper her name again and again when they have made love. Within days of meeting him, when she was at the work, Miranda began to wish that there was a picture of her and Dave tacked to inside of her cubicle, like one of Lakshmi's and her husband in front of a Taj Mahal. She didn't tell Lakshmi about Dave. She didn't tell anyone. Part of her wanted to tell Lakshmi, if only because Lakshmi was Indian too. But Lakshmi was always on the phone with her cousin these days, who was still in a bed, whose husband was still in London, and whose son still wasn't going to school. You must eat something, Lakshmi would urge. You must lose your health. When she wasn't speaking to her cousin, she spoke to her husband. Shorter conversation in which she ended up arguing about whether to have a chicken or a lamb for the dinner. I am sorry, Miranda heard her apologizes at one point. This whole thing just makes me a little paranoid. Miranda and Dave didn't argue. They went to the movies at the Nicholton and kissed the whole time. They ate the pulled pork and cornbread in Davies Square, a paper napkin tucked like a cravat into the shoulders collars of Dave's shirts. They sipped a sangira at the bar of a Spanish restaurant, a grinding pig head presiding over their conversation. They went to the MFA and picked out a poster of a wall lilies for her bedroom. One Saturday following an afternoon concert at Symphony Hall, he showed her his favorite place in the city, the Maparium at the Christian Science Center, where they stood inside a room made of glowing stained glass panels, which was shaped like the inside of a globe, but looked like the outside of one. In the middle of a room was a transparent bridge, so that they felt as if they were standing in the center of the world. Dave pointed to India, which was red and far more detailed than the map in the Economist. He explained that many of the countries like Same and Italy and Somaliland no longer existed in the same way. The names have changed by now. The ocean, as blue as the peacock's breast, appeared in two shades. Depending on the depth of the water, he showed her the deepest spot on the earth, 7 miles deep above the Marian Island. They peered over the bridge and saw the Antarctic archipelago after they feed, craned their necks and saw a giant metal star overhead. As Dave spoke, his voice bounced widely off the glass, sometimes loud, sometimes soft, sometimes seeing to the land in Miranda's chest, sometimes eluded her ear altogether. When a group of tourists walked on the bridge, she could hear them cleaning their throats, as if through the microphones. Dave explained that it was because of her assorties. Miranda found London, where Lakshmi, cousin's husband, was, with the women he had met on the plane. She wondered which of the cities in India Dave's wife was in. The farthest Miranda have ever been was to Bahamas once when he saw a child. She searched but couldn't find it on the glass panels. When the tourists left and she and Dave were alone again, he told her to stand at one end of the bridge even though they were 30 feet apart. Dave said they would be able to hear each other whispers. I don't believe you, Miranda said. It was the first time she had spoken since they have entered. She felt as if the speakers were embedded in her ears. Go ahead, he urged. Walking backward to his end of a bridge, his voice dropped to a whisper. Say something. She watched his lips forming the words. At the same time, she heard them so clearly that she felt them under her skin, under her winter coat, so near and full of warmth. She felt herself so hot. Hi, she whispered, unsure of what else to say. You're so sexy, he whispered back. At the work the following week, Lakshmi told Miranda that it wasn't the first time her cousin husband had an affair. She is decided to let him come to his senses. Lakshmi said one evening as they was getting ready to leave the office. She says that it for the boy. She will be willing to forgive him for the boy. Miranda waited as Lakshmi shut off her computer. He will come crawling back and she will let him. Lakshmi said, shaking her hand, not me. If my husband so much as looked at the another woman, I would change the locks. She studied the picture tacked to her cubicle. Lakshmi's husband has its arm wrapped over her shoulders, his knees kneeling in towards her on the bench. She turns to Miranda, "Wouldn't you?" She notes Dave's wife was coming back from India the next day. The afternoon he had called Miranda at the work to say that he had to go to airport to pick up her. He promised that he would call as soon as he could. "What is the Taj Mahal like?" she asked Lakshmi. "The most romantic spot on the earth." Lakshmi's face brightened at the memory, an everlasting moment of the person to love. Thank you.